And as Shirley just mentioned a moment ago, this isn't just global warming, climate change, and we attack it like most Americans do in a linear way. This is, we have to deal with climate refugees, we have to be dealing with plastics, we have to be dealing with economics, we have to be dealing with all of these things. The way my mind works, that's what I'm looking for and trying to understand. And then you have to peel this down and say, well, what is my truth about climate refugees? Or what is my truth about the capitalistic system that has done so much to benefit all of us? And how can we move that system in a way that serves the planet and people? So before I start talking about, quote, solutions to the climate crisis, or global warming and all the things that we can talk about that relate to each other, let me just tick off some of the conclusions that I have reached over these last 15 years or so of focusing pretty hard on this subject. One is, the world is in much greater trouble than we realize, than most people want to acknowledge. This global warming, climate change is coming at us faster, with greater intensity, and with greater damage, unfortunately. I don't like to say this, but I believe it to my core. There's the hockey stick effect. What's going on now is because we have not been paying attention in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, into this first 10 years of this century. It's far more serious now over these next 30 years to 2050 than it had to be. We had the chance for incremental change and we didn't take it. Now we have to take very substantial change, and it doesn't have to hurt. It just has to be substantial and in ways that I will articulate in just a moment. The science on all of this is very clear. The scientists really do agree. There are some outliers, but the science is very, very clear. That's not the question. The question is how human beings want to deal with that science or change their thinking about that science. And the science essentially says, in very general terms, the science says that between now and 2050, because of our lack of focus on this issue and the fact that the United States alone puts up 30 billion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere each year. Third thing I'll mention is we are not victims. No one should have a victim mentality about this, because we have total choice how this story ends. And the question is whether we have the capacity of the human race to take the actions necessary to deal. It is not we don't have a problem with the technology. The technology is there. Someone says, oh, it's a technology problem. Technologists will solve it. Technology won't be employed unless we have the political will to do it. I would add that over the last 2 years, particularly this last year, the momentum has shifted, finally. And I think you could feel it. The Yale Program for Climate Communications, which has been polling people in this great detail, Democrats, Republicans, young, old, Catholic faith, Jewish faith, all sorts of different dimensions, racial dimensions, et cetera, about what they think about global warming and climate change. One is those of us who are deeply alarmed, and I suspect a lot of people in this room are, deeply alarmed and actually taking actions in their food choices, their transportation choices, how they heat their home, all the things that we could talk about. Okay, that's over 100 million people. Okay, that's a lot of people who are deeply concerned and engaged. A year and a half ago, that number was 20%. We really only have 10 years to really turn this thing around, because of what I just implied, the hockey effect. And what I mean by that is, if you're looking at the graph, and this is 2020, and this is 2100, and sea level rise and temperature rise go slowly up. And then about mid-century, if we haven't done anything, it goes like this. And that's when civilization doesn't have much of a chance. Okay, that's a hell of a statement. But since I'm partnering that statement with the fact that we have total choice how this ends, and we have the capacity to do it, the technology. My point is, let's get on with it. We have an opportunity here. We're at that crux point in human evolution where I think it's really a privilege to be right here and feel, wow, I could make a difference. And the last point I'll say on these conclusions is, if we don't act, Mother Nature will remind us who is in charge. Those aren't our challenges. What is our challenge? What do we have to do to address this issue? To do what? And fundamentally, my view is that we have to change. I'm going to read my own words here because there's so many nuances to this thing. We have to change the deeply embedded global economic and business system powered by fossil fuels that has generated enormous economic growth over the last 75 years since the end of the Second World, of which I and most of the people in this room are totally the beneficiaries. Fossil fuel used to be called liquid gold for good reason. It was amazing what it could do in terms of plastics and power planes and power cars and all the things that we benefited from. But now its time has got to end. Not because it's bad, it's because of the unintended consequences of it. We created the system, so now we have the opportunity to change it in subtle but very strategic ways to deal with the challenge that we have created. But our country and the world, our country is addicted, and that's the right word as far as I'm concerned. We're addicted to fossil fuels. So the challenge is how to muster the individual, community, and collective and national power to shift that away from fossil fuels to renewables that are now in many cases cheaper anyway. But how to unembed the system. Yeah, that is our challenge. Now I want to make a bit of a confession. I've never made this confession before, and I'm glad to make it. I was, in many respects, part of the problem. We all were, by the way. But part of the problem, and this is not to brag at all on my part, but to say how deeply involved and committed I was to economic development of countries around the world, to helping corporations expand their businesses around the world, and feeling that all of this time during those years, particularly after I left the diplomatic service and where I was involved deeply in Asia during the Johnson and Nixon administrations, and went to a firm called Arthur D. Little, which is a well-known consulting firm, where I was the head of Asia for 10 years. And I worked for Citibank. Citibank hired Arthur D. Little, and I ended up being the head of the case. And they said, Citibank came to us and said, "Okay, we're going to have a 10-year plan that we're working on for our entire businesses of Citibank, all around the world, and we want you to predict what the world's going to look like over these 10 years." And we said, well, no one can predict the future, and we can't either, and neither can you. But what we can do is we can tell you what the driving forces are that are likely to push the world in one direction or another. Nationalism, economic issues, social issues, the rise of China, whatever it may be, okay? And so I had about 50 or 60 people working. Some were working on various regions and countries in the world. Others were working on various industries, software, hardware, all this kind of stuff. And we pulled it together, and we then said, this is the likely future, and that's about a 70% chance, and this way and that. And therefore, if we can't predict that, but we can tell you, if the world is moving in that direction, these are some of the implications for your business. I taught in Iran international business management there, and I was the head of a study both in Taiwan and then in Korea to help them think through what their next, in one case, 5-year plan and the other 10-year plan for their electronics industry. My point in mentioning all of that is that was the story that I told myself, that economic development driven by fossil fuels would help build populations, build prosperity, and help corporations be profitable and help everybody, da-da-da-da-da. I confess that there were two things that I didn't take into account in my headlong rush into all of these things over those years. One was I didn't distinguish between bad economic activity and good economic activity. And what I mean by we have had a notion of economic growth at all costs to planet and often people. Our good friends Pachamama Alliance, some of you know Pachamama Alliance, they're down focused. They started, the twists started in Ashwar territory in the Amazon, where Texaco went down there and was pumping oil out and wrecking their habitat, wrecking the land and damaging the livelihood of the people. And that was all counted as economic growth. We have a system that is based on economic growth at all costs, and that drives us. And we measure our success that way, but we're measuring our success in ways that are not serving people and planet in many cases. So I didn't focus on that, is my point. And the second thing I didn't focus on is the subject of this evening, which is the unintended consequences of fossil fuels into the atmosphere. So that was the story, if you will, that I was telling in my head. That was the story that we were all living, okay? That was the great success of the Western world that then got spread to other parts of the world. In terms of the new story on the values side, I think we need to have a vision of what is possible. That's why I asked that question the way I did, of what is possible if we all start to work together, and how we can create something that is even more satisfying in terms of human beings. People talked about community and things like that, which obviously I'm referring to. I think it is important that that vision or that story acknowledge that global warming and climate change are really a clear and present danger, that that's what we're referring to. That's the anchor. That it's based on hope and not fear. It's a positive, not a negative. That it offers future generations the possibility of healthy and meaningful lives. Another piece is the importance of balance and harmony. There are really three things that indigenous people can teach us that we have forgotten in our headlong rush to modernity. One is that they hold the natural world as sacred. It's not property. It's something that they want to steward so that in turn they can benefit from that stewardship in terms of survival and agriculture and all the rest. So we need to shift the relationship between ourselves and the natural world so we get in harmony, in balance with the natural world. That's very fundamental. The second is that we have moved so far away from being in relationship to each other in community. And the third is we seem to have lost our sense of our relationship with ourselves. The second is terms of the shift in the system. How are we going to move away from the deeply embedded parts of our system that no longer serve us? And what I'm referring to is we have to get off this addiction. We have to do it in a matter of years, not decades even. Incrementalism doesn't work as it might have in the 70s and the 80s, et cetera, as I said. And we need to create an economic system that, one, is fueled by renewables. That's totally possible. Obviously, there are some industries like that is challenging to do that, but it's possible. Distinguish between economic growth that harms people and planet and growth that supports people and planet. I mentioned that before. That redefines prosperity. That we no longer think of prosperity just in terms of the money in our pocket, but in terms of our relationships and all the rest. And how do we do that? That maintains an economic system that maintains high employment and social stability. I feel deeply that most of the people that are in this room who are not youth need to really get behind the youth. They are speaking truth to power. And they don't have power, except they have power only in their ability to galvanize, mobilize a movement, to wake those people up who are so deeply embedded in our system of money and oil and politics, that we need to break that link and move to a positive system. It's not tearing it down, it's bringing about shifts in it. And the youth, I think, Greta, who we all talk about, when she was a 15-year-old girl, she sat all by herself in the rain in that parliament in Sweden. And 2 years later, she's speaking in front of the United Nations and at Davos and at other places. So she touched a nerve. She spoke truth to power and people heard it. And power is actually responding. She can't make the changes, but she's got their attention. The Sunrise Movement is doing a terrific job, okay? Really is. I give you I'm so proud of what you're doing. I put the subtitle of my book in our hands, A Handbook for Intergenerational Actions to Solve the Climate Crisis. And what I thought, and what I've now done the research to support, is that our generation has more financial resources than his generation has. We have more contacts that may be pertinent to some of the solutions that they're wrestling with. We have time. Okay? We have some experience that may be relevant. Maybe some of it's not, but may be relevant. And I think we should have a little bit of guilt. In this book that I wrote, I said this, which now seems to be becoming, I won't read it from here, I'll just read here. To many, the response from the business world to the challenge of climate change was surprising. Many businesses realized that it was in their self-interest to act, and they proved more agile than imagined. They could see the spiraling costs of operating in climate chaos. They knew that they would not only lose money, but also customers, talented employees, and investors if they did not authentically address the issues of reducing carbon emissions and the efficient use of resources. Millennials in particular were quick to call out corporations that sought to continue business as usual. Now, since that time, BlackRock, which is the world's largest financial advising firm, which has $7 trillion under investment, has come out, Lawrence Fink, the CEO, and basically say, not because we're do-gooders, he didn't use that terminology, of course. He said, because the world is moving off of fossil fuels, we are shifting our portfolios off of fossil fuels. That's $7 trillion. That's sort of big money. Okay, now that's not all going to happen one day and all the rest. You see endowments of universities that because of pressure from the students, the trustees are saying, okay, you're right. Okay? You're seeing JetBlue that came out to become say they could become carbon neutral in all their flights in the United States by July of 2020, partly using biofuels. You see Microsoft that came out a month ago and said that they will be carbon negative by 2030. So I wanted to be ending up here in a very positive note. The shift is taking place, and you all, and myself, and he, and everybody else, has to be really focused like a laser on doing what we can do. Okay, some people can dry the laundry on the line, and other people can change the trajectory of $7 trillion in financial assets. So I'm suggesting we get on with it. We can do it. The future is indeed in your hands, my hands. Thank you very much.